experience and some of the thoughts and results of a shared individual work on Kol Nidre and related stuff. Mark and Ruthie prepared a rich ground 4 weeks ago for our seminar tonight. They both mentioned the apparent gap between text and melody in Kol Nidre, a sort of dry legal text set to the most moving melody. They quoted Ederson, considered father of Jewish musicology, who maintained that it is the melody rather than the text which bestows pathos and religious weight on the opening of Yom Kippur services in the Ashkenazi tradition. Ruthie, Mark, and Ruth Langer all seem to doubt this gap. We wish to reinforce their doubt and claim that text, sound, and function in the service should be viewed in the actual performance of Kol Nidre as a unified whole. Taking together all four components, text, sound, function, and performance, render Kol Nidre into a powerful liturgical moment. We will soon explain what we mean by liturgical moment. But first, I invite you, just a moment. I invite you to read with me a poem by the Jerusalemite poetess Zelda, a cousin of the last Chabad rabbi. She was born in 1914 in Chernihiv, Russian Empire, and emigrated to Palestine at the age of 11. Her delicate personal religiosity found a strong resonance with the Israeli public at large. I translated the poem to English for our gathering today, but allow me first to read it in Hebrew. בערב יום הכיפורים הפלגנו מניסיונות שתמו אל ניסיונות שהחלו. ערב יום הכיפורים היה לנו ראשית הזמן, בדממת אי שהאיר ים ונרות, שם אימצת אותי אל לבך הדואב, לפני הכל יכול, בטרם תלך להתפלל עם כולם, בטרם תהיה אחד מן העדה בהיכל, אחד מן העצים ביער. And now in English, Yom Kippur Eve. On Yom Kippur Eve, we sailed from trials that ended to trials that started. Yom Kippur Eve was the beginning of time for us in the silence of island that lit ocean with candles, where you embraced me to your aching heart before the Almighty, before you would go to pray with them all, before you become one of the congregation in the shrine, one of the tree in the forest. Time becomes an ocean in Zelda's imagined world. We human beings are sailing on it from one slippery trial to another. The trials are not just terrains we arrive in, they're also the sailing itself. The journey is shaky, perilous. It is Yom Kippur, the island of silence, which gives the traveler some moments of respite, but also of angst. The island throws its light on the ocean of time which surrounds it, and what one can observe is darkness. Listen to this line again. מניסיונות שתמו אל ניסיונות שהחלו. From trials that ended to trials that started. And I ask, this line, doesn't it echo מיום כיפורים שעבר ועד יום כיפורים זה, ומיום כיפורים זה עד יום כיפורים הבא עלינו לטובה? You see the translation here. Of course, taken from the text itself, which I will not read, but that you can remind yourself when it is here on the screen. So our vows are now before we actually started the new year. All those we vehemently swore the year before and never fulfilled, we declare void. Maybe some of them were wrong to begin with. The unbearable lightness of such gestures of cancel vexed Jews and non-Jews alike for many centuries. They were also a cause for virulent anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, anti-Jewishness. Many of these attacks and perplexities, we wish to argue, miss the deep insight underlying this apparently technical text. Adapting insights of psychoanalyst Theodor Reich's 1918 Kol Nidre treatise, we suggest the following. We declare our promises null because with all our good intentions, repentance, decisions to be better, we know that we will fail. Kol Nidre, we argue, is first and foremost a disclaimer, and one hard to make. Such a disclaimer before it all starts stands like a chronicle of a failure foretold. There will be trials and we will only partially withstand them. We know that from our former trials and errors. During the fast evening and following day, we'll mention other human weaknesses, but none will be as powerful as the Kol Nidre moment. We repeat the entire text of Kol Nidre 3 times. True, this is how Hatarat Nedarim, cancelling of oath, should take place according to the Jewish law. More on this later by Boaz. But at the beginning of this holy day, it transforms the text into a statement of defense. It also stands as a profession to ourselves and to others in the forest of congregants. We acknowledge our frail nature, and in spite of it, we pray. Und trotzdem bete ich, and despite it all, I pray, wrote Arnold Schoenberg, and set this text to music in his modern Psalms. But not only the Kol Nidre text repeats 3 times, also the opening Or Zarua, the Al Da'at HaMakom, and the closing Venislach, and the Vayomer Adonai Salachti Kidvarecha are thrice recited. Such repetitions are rare in the Jewish liturgy. They feature Kol Nidre, the most forceful, performative speech act. If we haven't paid attention to the declaration in the first round, we may do it in the second and the third. We will enter into the trance. We will let ourselves carry by it. The words will be engraved on our hearts, even if we do not understand them in the first place. All of this, wish to argue, render what we call the grand overture of Yom Kippur a powerful liturgical moment. By liturgical moment, we mean those performative parts of the liturgy in which Shliach Tzibur, the cantor, and congregation pause for a short span of time for regathering spiritual energies and retuning their souls. Mostly they occur before a major part starts. They may embolden a text or give vent to an emotional load. In the Jewish liturgy, particularly the Ashkenazi one, such moments are solemnized by vocal concentration after some heterophonic, or if you wish, that's how I call it in the book that was mentioned, noisy sort of participation by the praying community. Boaz will explain this in more detail soon. So what we wish to argue is that this liturgical event is not created by the music, or better by the sound alone. Rather, both the music and the text derive their characteristics from the designation of Kol Nidre as a moment. Still, it is the sonic embodiment that shapes it as a deep and highly fragile religious moment. Through the music, threads to other parts of the liturgy are woven, as Boaz will show. But mostly, the sonic delivery of the text erects the whole opening from Or Zarua to Shechianu, as a moving monument that mobilizes all. It erects it in terms of the relatively wide ambitus it traverses, and we'll talk about this later on, very big range in comparison to other parts of the liturgy. The dramatic shifts it enacts, its melancholic beginning and triumphant ending. But it all depends on a shliach tzibur, able to animate it, and a well-tuned community ready to reverberate it. Interestingly, many, though not all of these moments, were recognized musically, part of them through special tunes. Those tunes, titled at some point as Nigunim Misinai, the Sinai tunes, they are considered the oldest parts of the Ashkenazi tradition. I took here, you see this map is from the 11th century, not the map itself, but it depicts 11th century Europe, and somewhere here, it all started, Ashkenazi tradition. So Kol Nidre belongs to both groups. It is a grand liturgical moment, as well as a highly embellished tune from Sinai, quote unquote. It is, however, exceptional in another important aspect, which further marks its uniqueness. It does not behave as the usual reciting of the text, what is called in the insider's jargon, nusach. So originated probably in the ancient Rhine communities, both nusach and the Misinai tunes have dispersed in Europe, east and west, throughout the last millennium. There are oral and written vestiges testifying for this general uniformity, though, of course, variants abound. We can quite strongly state that within this large repertoire, Kol Nidre had a central place, meaning a Jewish traveler from about the 17th century onward, had he been stuck in a remote Jewish community on Yom Kippur Eve, and I'm sure it happened to many Jews, would have encountered in the synagogue he would enter to pray the familiar sounds of Kol Nidre, which brings me to the second part and to give Boaz his turn.
I'll take it from the Misinai. The entire territory we call Misinai tunes or Manginot Misinai is not fully explored, and some of its aspects may always remain unknown. I'm sorry, I hear some background noises. Okay. In general, we're not covering the whole issue of Misinai tunes, it's not involved. But although there are different opinions about what the actual list of these tunes includes, with no primary source in evidence, there is a consensus, though, that Kol Nidre is one of them. I also mentioned two others that are relevant to the issue at hand, the Kaddish and the Aleinu, both in the Musaf service of the High Holiday. So let's look at the example here of the Kaddish. So most of us recognize it goes Yit Gadal veYitkadash Meherabah Ve'alemadi Be'rachirutei Ve'yalish Malchutei. And here comes a tune. We recognize this. This tune, by the way, is not in the original Misinai tunes. It's added later, but we're not getting into it here. But it's particularly significant that it's actually there. And it will plug into the, when we talk about the performance participation of the congregation. Let's look at the Aleinu. I'll just start it. It's a special setting. It's not really the common one, but it goes, Aleinu leshabeach. Here they go, Ladon HaKol, which usually what will happen is Aleinu Leshabeach Adon HaKol. And if you notice, what I just sang is actually what appears here at the end, circled by this green line, because it goes this is important, keep it in mind, because we revisit it later. But we need to keep in mind, however, that the term melody or tune may be misleading, because the melodies also have a particular way in which they present unique motifs and in the way in which they behave. The tunes, as mentioned, also include short melodic fragments, modular options, and some insertions of free chant. This partly responds to Ruth Langer's Ruth Langer's correct observation about differences among local practices in general. Yet we do not consider them different versions, but local variants of the same tune. In its very essence, the synagogue service is a multi-layered amalgam of numerous experiential, intellectual, emotional, verbal, sonic, visual, and conceptual phenomena. And here we run into a little bit of a difficulty so far as the premise is concerned. Complex audiovisual and spatial dramaturgical elements, emotional content, and involvement of the community. I hear background music. Please, everybody, mute yourselves. In other words, dramaturgical elements, emotional content, and involvement of the community are the fundamental constituents of all liturgical occurrences in the synagogal universe. In addition, speech acts and various other performative structure are a constitutional foundation of the very essence of Jewish liturgical text and ritual. This brings us back again to the present of the moment and the way it relates to other liturgical parts of this law. In other words, the model of moment can help us overcome those general properties that they don't put Kol Nidre as a special occasion. Let us more deeply into the defining properties of moments. My first point is that a moment is a notable change in the sense of time. Both psychologically and cognitively, a moment constitutes a qualitatively different span of time, as well as a perceived sense that time stands still, a sort of momentarily stepping out of time. In addition to psychological and cognitive factors, there is a concrete, even measurable, quantifiable factor to the notable slowing down of the unfolding of the liturgy. This is due to the simple fact that most of the words and the text as a whole are performed much more slowly, and thus literally occupying a longer time span. It is also a consequence of the melismas and the additional vocalies, which I'll elaborate on later. The norm of performance likewise affects this perception, and I will elaborate on that norm of performance also. There are a few subtraits related to the role of the moment in terms of the musical text and ritual. Kol Nidre, as we emphasize, is not a prayer. For that matter, none of the textual ritualistic components of other moments are prayers, at least not in the accurate terminology and concept of the Jewish liturgy. Indeed, as Ruth already pointed out, there is a particular relationship between the status of the text factor and its musical realization. In a moment, the text goes beyond its literal meaning to match its transformation into a sung text at a particular spot in time, one that acts as a grand preparation to what follows. One aspect of this different status of the text is the fact that in most moments, the text at hand appears in more than one liturgical context, and in the case of Kol Nidre, also in non-liturgical, as the Katarak Nedarim goes. Indeed, during a moment, such texts gain this sense of extra significance which is missing from the other circumstance. A case in which the text appears once, actually, yet it's probably the most extreme so far as the text is concerned, is a liturgical section during the High Holiday entitled the Hineni. The entire Hineni is in essence a private appeal of the Shliach Tzibur to God, humbly asking permission to represent the congregation in prayer. It is full of self-deprecation, claims of general unworthiness, and specifically of not being worthy of the task. Its language implores with extreme humility that the speaker be allowed to perform it nevertheless. There is a most paradoxical relationship between such a text on paper and its grand performance and choreography in the synagogue. Some of us are familiar with that. Kol Nidre is a sort of hineni for the entire congregation. Yet it shares also with the other two liturgical moments mentioned above, High Holiday Kaddish and Aleinu. All are actually not prayers, but declarations of sorts. Also, the Kaddish and the Kol Nidre is mostly in Aramaic. There's a lot to say about that, but that's beyond our time here. But it's certainly an issue, and it concerns the issue of moment and text as well. Location and timing of moments in the liturgy. The synagogue service has its own particular manner of starting. There's almost no telling when exactly a synagogue service begins. Rather, there is a gradual accumulation of fragments of actions, including inducing physical conduct of people. They're not even a congregation yet. They're artifacts, textual fragments chanted quite approximately, a single line or two followed by silence or heterophonic chant mumbling. Let me elaborate. Chant mumbling is one of those normal performances that Ruth described as noise. It's basically when each member of the congregation sings some kind of a pattern that's similar, but not at the right time, not at the same tune, and also in a different speed. So what we hear is this cloud of murmuring that people are familiar with, probably. There are also semi-whispers, then another line of the Shliach Tzibur, etc., and all of which very gradually converges into the very beginning of the service. And they become a more solid and more present and significant. This particular characteristic stands as a diametrical opposition of the moment, because moment starts big and it's very dramatic. Indeed, the moment is not the very beginning of a service, but functions within a service already in motion as a turning point to a new section or a new liturgical ritual or the presentation of a new theme. As such, the text also takes on another layer of significance because it also serves as an announcement of what to follow and a declaration of intent. The singing of Kol Nidre is indeed not the opening of the service. Harkening back to what Ruth said in the introduction, with the repetition of Ozahua, and it's 3 times at least, but often it's repeated a lot more, other preparatory fragments actions occur, not the least of which is taking out the Torah scrolls. And it's followed by the repeated B'Yeshiva Shel Mala, and all of this happens before the singing of Kol Nidre itself begins, all the while people are entering and tuning in. In other words, all this stuff happens when people are still not tuned in, and the peak of concentration happens when the actual Kol Nidre starts. Moving now to the norms of performance of the moment. As a rule, a moment takes on what we call a cantorial rhapsody. It's a term that I made because originally they were talking about cantorial recitative, but that's really misleading because it sounds a lot more like an elaborate cantorial aria. Thus, ornamentation, elaboration, melismas, and vocalizes are markers of the performance in a moment. At times, they grow even into coloratura and bravura, depending on the cantor and the local meaning. There is also a particular manner of the congregation's involvement. Fragments of congregational participation, normally not found elsewhere, in which for a brief passing motif, the congregation joins the Shliach Tzibur in unison. In other words, it's not mumbling and it's not singing a complete tune. There is a motif that the cantor sings and the congregation joins. In Kol Nidre, the two typical spots are the congregations joining anytime a motif such as the words shvitim, shvitim appears, which goes Thank you, Ruth. This is what it sounds like with the congregation. There's another common spot where the congregation joins the Shliach Tzibur is at any time when a cadence that is identical to the last one appears in the middle of the section. And let's explain. The last dramatic cadence is always La Shavuot, which everybody is familiar with, but the motif da-da-da-da also appears in the middle. For example, V'yasadna alav shatana, or Avalenu letova. These are the same motifs at the end, but they're in the middle and the congregation joins there. As we suggested, despite the title Momentun, these nigunim do not really behave like melodies in the regular sense. I shall discuss this in more detail, especially the particular modular motif melodic fragments and mini phrases based manner of conduct in the next section. Further, there is also an additional factor of directivity insofar as these constituent building blocks are concerned, for which I turn back to Ruth.
Thank you, Boaz. And that's the third part. The melody moves. It moved the Austrian poet Lenau in the 19th century, for whom the Kol Nidre he attended was so fraught with terror and yet so rich in mercy. It moved many others, not necessarily born and raised in a Jewish environment. It also moves in the sense of creating what we call momentum. How it moves in the first sense. It moves Jews and non-Jews through a delicate tension it carries between emotional idioms Jewish music shares with Western music and those which are unique to it. Listen to the opening. First, we will look at it. It moves around the finalis, that's the G in this particular rendition. Autumnal center with those, what we call in Western music, sighs, sospiri, in the Italian tradition, supplications, and the person who did this particular rendition, this transcription, emphasized it. And so on. So these were familiar to the Christian Lenau, for that matter, to many others. Okay, just look at this, and you can see even visually that they create through this opening phrase several arches. This is a convex arch, and then there is a concave one, another concave one, and there can be another. It depends on the specific variants. So you have it. Kol Nidre. It's not exactly what you are familiar with, because that's something that I will relate to later. So now cantors opt whether to set this intro to the entire opening phrase, Kol Nidre, etc., or as a wordless strain, just like the one that we see here. That's what we mean by degree of freedom. You must start with this melancholic ground. Let's call it A. You see this phrase here in several different renditions. An emotional starting it is, a starting point for much that will transpire. But how exactly to go about it is your choice. Listen to these two versions. And if you have your earphones, it will be better to listen to it in this way. So The first one is by Josef Basser, a cantor who worked in the Kluggasse synagogue in Vienna at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is a recording from 1906, so early. And he recites the entire first textual phrase on this part A. And so please listen to it. So you hear what just Boaz told you, that towards the end here it's a choir, but that they are joining towards the cadence. Now the second example is by the renowned cantor Zebulun or Zaval Kvartim, relating to a different sub-tradition, recites only the Kol Nidre words, as we saw in the noted example, the first one that I showed you, relating, and that's drawing a legato melisma as an opening announcement. Listen to it. Both choose to traverse the entire range of octave in the solemn opening from a fifth below to a fifth above. Another Baal Tefillah, much more recently, just actually recorded last year. His name, as you see here, is Eliyahu Kellerman, and he is a Chazan, Baal Tefillah in the Kol Nidre Yeshiva in Jerusalem. It was recorded by our student Rachel Katzir, and you can just listen to him. It's entirely a different tradition.
Ahai, 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 Kol Nidre.
You see what he's doing, again from the fifth below, that he is just going up to just a second above the finalis. So he's very modest in the way he opens this very important opening of the day. In other words, as a shliach tzibur, you can choose your own model and carve your own style, but you'd better be attentive as well to the tzibur, the congregation that sends you. A powerful Kol Nidre moment is the one that combines the two, cantor and community, sensitive as well to prevailing moods and changing circumstances. Variations abound. Look at the diagram here. That's, as was mentioned beforehand already, it's courtesy of, just a moment, of Arnold Schoenberg. He laid versions of cantors, he found one on top of the others, as a matrix for his Kol Nidre, composed in 1938, after the Kristallnacht. By the way, the Kristallnacht, that synagogues that we saw beforehand of Kvartim, of Basser, was one of those that were destroyed in that night. So he just did it after that, but it was already in the United States. So you see here that Shaw in this version, this cantor Shaw, he copied it from his notebook. He's doing instead of just ta-da-da-dee, ta-da-dee, what he's doing is ta-da-da-da-da-dee, da-dee-da-dee-da-dee, so they are both arriving to this higher note, as well as this person, that he's doing something on the way to that peak note. So all these are arches, are icons of beseech. They turn the technical text, despite itself, into praying gestures. Then a dramatic turn transpires. You are all familiar with it. It became the standard, especially in American synagogues at that point. Let's call it B. Listen to Kvarti. His version is similar to Kol Nidre, that is here, in Schoenberg's diagram. Both and others move upward, reaching the sevenths above the finalis, though still remaining in the minor mode. Kvartin then allows himself to soar upward out of the melancholic realms. Kol Nidre, on the other hand, you don't see him here, but he goes back, he refers back to the first melancholic beginning and ends the whole phrase, the whole section, again with the size of the beginning of Kol Nidre. So we'll hear Kvarti now. Something else, call it C. That's what he's doing. Descended from the same Kol Nidre branch. Further research is needed to map them all and get a better notion of how those variants evolved and spread. In any event, the shift they make, first of all, they are going to what we call the parallel major, to B flats in this particular transcription. But after a few notes, they are going back to the melancholic center. Basser, in a grand gesture, extricates himself, as we heard, and the community into tones of glory. And this Heller is going to the B phrase that he skipped before him. So Heller, as Basser, in general, is unique because he's doing something very beautiful without ever touching this B phrase. So he manages to go through the entire thing, which we think is so much part of the Kol Nidre, and he shows that it's not necessary. So if you take each of these variants as a whole, something we cannot do tonight for obvious reasons, you will find diverse roads these cantors took. They converge and diverge, yielding different journeys. Yet those choices are not free. On a more general level, we can state that what you choose as the Shliach Tzibur compels you. You are bound to a certain general norms related to melody, order, and form, and to your own mode of navigation through them. And this takes us to the fourth part, and almost the last one. After this, we have just a conclusion. So, Boaz, it's for you. Boaz, you are muted. Boaz, you are muted. Start from the beginning.
That's so good. Out of the numerous motifs and melody fragments, I choose to shed light on three. I just want to recall your attention that there are many more motifs than what I'm mentioning, and even more motifs than Ruth HaCohen presented, but we choose to focus on a few. I choose those three because one of the traits they feature is their appearance elsewhere in the liturgy. In the sung liturgy of Ashkenazi tradition, we have identified a particular group of motifs that are not designated to one mode or a particular text or time or occasion alone. Rather, they cut through these different categories throughout the entire repertoire. I have titled them in another article, cross-repertoire motifs. In Kol Nidre, we find one of those cross-repertory motifs, and it's a main motif, and a few mini phrases that appear also in other occasions. The first cross-repertoire motif appears, for example, in Betelim umevutalim. If we get the example, I could show you the references and how it corresponds with other motifs, but I need the example for that. Okay, if you see the bottom, that's from Kol Nidre. And on top, I just brought a few examples. There is one from after the Hashkivenu on Shabbat. Ve'al Yerushalayim, the end. Ve'al Yerushalayim. And also on the last psalm before Lechadodi, Adonai Yevarech et Amo Bashalom. There's another one of the three festivals which still exists in the Nusach, although originally it was used as a transition to a piyut Leil Shimurim, which you probably no longer say, but he goes, El Chai V'Kayam Tamid Yimloch Aleinu Le'olam Va'ed. Note the end. Le'olam Va'ed Betelim U'Talim. And on Mincha for Shabbat, that's the next example where it says example 5. Where you see the bracket is the same motif. Again, it's a mosaic. We can always put this motif, but this motif appears in Kol Nidre as another motif, not clear whether a real cross-repertoire one, is the last dramatic motion towards the final cadence. And again, I demonstrate it as a motif that happens in the middle, but at the end, it's the triumphant moment. KN stands for Kol Nidre, and it goes, Ushvuatan ala shvuot. David Chazanim likes to show there, throw off. It appears in the beginning of the Amidah, the Chazarah of the Amidah on Shabbat morning, Baruch atah Hashem, Eloheinu v'Elokei avoteinu, the same thing. And significantly enough, it also happens in different places during the Chazarat Hashatz of the Amidah. In the high holiday itself, this happens in few places. I chose one example where it starts Baruch atah Hashem, and then he goes back to Eloheinu v'Elokei avoteinu. or the Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, etc. Again, the same motif. The third motif that features with similar resonance with other liturgical occasions is the same shvitim shvikin motif that we already sang. You see here KN Kol Nidre, shvitim shvitim. And in Shabbat Mincha, which I already demonstrated, but I'll start again. How did it start? אתה אחד ושמך אחד, ומי כעמך ישראל, גוי אחד בארץ. And here comes the motif, תפארת וגדולה, תפארת וגדולה, תא שביתים. The same motif appears in another place, but here it's bound to be a little different because we're talking about different modes, a different notes collection, and that's in the three festivals, Chazarat HaShatz, both in the morning Shacharit and in the Musaf, in a place like V'hasienu Adonai Eloheinu et Moed Moedecha. In other words, V'hasienu Shevitin, a little different, but still the same contour and basically the same notes with a chromatic change that is forced on us because of the mode itself. Another aspect, not really motif like that, but it concerns the melismatic vocal elaborations, which I mentioned earlier in this talk. These vocalises are basically free. They depend on the individual performer, and here again, the difference between different variants of the same thing. But it follows a motif that by itself already sounds like a long melisma. And you see here, this is from the Edelson collection, the beginning, but here, the thing that is circled by green sounds like a melisma and an elaboration, but it's actually an organic motif of the building blocks of Kol Nidre. The interesting thing is right after this, perhaps it sort of opens the gates to then improvisation of some kind of a vocalist. So he goes, and then he goes, that's just a free, they sing it on or on whatever, but it's a free melisma. But again, the important part is that it comes at this particular point, and it starts with something that sounds like a vocalist, but that's an integral part of the model. We heard the same thing in Ruth examples with Kvartim does that, and also Heller. And that reminds me of probably one of the most popular settings of Kol Nidre by Rusotto, especially in America. And he does the same thing at the same spot. That I'll do from memory. He starts with the same motif in green. At the end, for example, and then he goes, oh. It was the same thing as Heller, but again, the first is part of the motif, and then improvisation of some kind of a melisma, coloratura. Oh. Now, there is a cousin of this particular phenomenon, because there are also other shorter insertions which seem more instrumental, not like a vocal elaboration. It seems like instrumental in the nature. They sound like as if a musical instrument performed them. And something of this kind I found again in the same transcription that Rachel Katzir did, and she recorded it. It was by Chazan Eli Kellerman. I actually am going to try to perform it in one of the ways that maybe they performed it back then. And you see that there is a recitation note without words. So obviously it sounds like some instrument should play, but they sing it. Maybe it's like, now I realize that sounds perhaps a little farcical, but that's exactly the point, because we do have at least some verbal indication in the sources that yes, that they actually, even sometimes not Jewish, that they're laughing at the Jews performing something so silly, trying to sound like instruments and doing silly stuff. This connects, of course, to another phenomenon, the Chazan Beis Zinger, which we're not getting into, but it's related to it. And in Ruth's book, The Music Bible Against the Jews, she brings all of these documents and she talks about it in detail. Because it's instrumental, these are actually closer to what Hanoch Aveneri calls a traditional cantorial fantasia. I'm not going to get into that, but that's like this kind of style in West Europe. Interestingly enough, in the recording of Cantor Kellerman, he is not 17th or 18th century Europe, and he's probably from East Europe. So he solved it in sort of a Hasidic or pseudo-Hasidic way that we're all used to it, and he says, ay, 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 ay. To us, that sounds less ridiculous because we're used to ay-ay-ay's, but I think in terms of the control of fantasia and the part that sounds more instrumental, in West Europe, it was done a little different. The meaning of using these and other motifs is multifaceted. We should mention here that they do instill a sense of familiarity. Even if communists do not necessarily recognize the exact cross-reference, they sense them, so that the experience of the moment gains additional dimensions. It becomes richer as it resonates with other calendrial events and with the liturgical experience as a whole. It bestows at once festivity and domesticity, even without a conscious awareness of what is at play here. And I'm going to sort of borrow from neurobiology, if you permit me. At least by analogy, this input plugs directly in what we know is the limbic system of the brain, bypassing the cerebral cortex altogether. And this sort of brings us a full circle, because this in turn is really the ideal state of what such liturgical experience should be. Moving on.
So let us review the full picture of Kol Nidre as we sketched it so far. We conceive Kol Nidre as a unique liturgical moment fraught with existential overtones. In the soundscape typical of the Ashkenazi tradition, it marks a moment of pause when time stands still. It is a sort of island within an island, referring back to Zelda's imagery, a moment before we plunge into a day of prayer and a year of trial. It brims of generations' emotional surges, is shaped by hosts of Shlichei Tzibur, who carved it individually for the specific time, place, and community. How it all started. What was the first musical phrase from which it sprouted? Who further shaped it, and where and when it spread around? The mystery of its genesis would remain forever sealed, we guess. But still, there is much that can be said much that can be said. Kol Nidre, we learned, is distinguished by its unique melodic unfolding, constructed as a mosaic of distinct units. It stages a condensed emotional odyssey, starting with melancholy. Its ebbs and flows lead triumphantly to a resolution, and then starts all over again, 3 times. Each time stronger and stronger. That's how it's written already in the Vitry Machzor, back in the High Middle Ages. It is checkered by cross-repertory motifs. They connect it subconsciously to other calendarial spots, loaded with meaning. The combinatory rules entertain certain degrees of freedom, allowing for some improvisatory variants. Cantors and their congregations can move through them creatively, or, and that's the danger, they might become fixed, losing their vitality and imaginative power. This is the danger awaiting all since the age of reproduction, and the Rusotto example that Boaz mentioned before is a very good example for that. The flip side of it, of the age of reproduction, is that the richness of variants and modes of performance that cantors and congregations have access to enable them to shape new variants of their own, especially since the time of the last 15 years of the YouTube, so people can really learn a lot from many other traditions and cantors and ballet fila and so on. So still, the question is whether it's still a live tradition. More about vocal communities and their connection to this liturgical moment in 8 weeks from now. I have the honor to come again. Hopefully you will bear me. Though the present community gathered here tonight cannot be vocal because of obvious reasons, yet we expect its members to come up now with questions. And I saw that you had lots of questions in the chats, but I apologize, we couldn't look at them while we have to handle it all together and to also with the PowerPoint and everything. So only now can refer to them. So we expect questions and comments to which we will happily respond. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ruth and Boaz, for a fascinating and very much thought-provoking lecture. I think if you would take a look at the chat, you would see that there was a lively discussion during your whole talk. Why don't you take a few moments to sort of go over them to see if there's something you'd like to comment on. And in the meantime, I can maybe open the floor for questions, comments, any sort of reaction. And I see that, first of all, Charles Heller is asking, what is hypertext?
Okay. Boaz? Boaz, you're unmuted.
Ruth, we discussed this just like 3 hours ago. So Ruth, that's your domain. Go for it.
Okay, hypertext refers to the fact that one text is at the same time what we sometimes call intertextuality, that within one text there are references to many other texts, but that hypertext is more that it sends you to all these places. What Boaz tried to show beforehand is that unconscious or subconsciously, to be more accurate, you hear all the things and you feel that you are familiar with them, you don't know exactly where from, but they somehow spread their branches through the whole calendarial liturgical year, and in this way, Kol Nidre is relating. You know, that Yom Kippur at large relates to the year, and they are opening the year, and there are all kinds of things, all kinds of gestures related to what's going to come. So in that way, it becomes a hypertext. So it's not just, it's unique, but at the same time, it refers to all these different holidays and special prayers and so on. Okay, thank you.
I don't know who is moderating. I already wrote you that there is one comment that Ruthie, go.
No, please, Boaz. I saw your comment. Please.
Yeah, I think it's important because somebody by the name Esti put a comment here that's really, I can't just let it stay like this because it has errors and it's misleading. First of all, the first two examples are not necessarily cadences, and we have to figure out that I just gave you 3 examples. There are lots of different across repertory, but for example, there's first of all, there's a difficulty in terms of even talking about cadences in this particular repertoire. But if you so choose, sometimes it's not a in the Shalosh Regalim, it's actually a transition. Even betelim uvutalim la I cannot see it as a cadence. It's actually, if anything, it's sort of a beginning or a scene to the next thing. And of course, well, Valakayamim, yes, it is a cadence, but one of them is, and a lot of them are not. Also, the whole idea, it says something like you cannot, there is not a cross repertoire. That's, look, this is an immense topic, and I wrote a long article about this. There is such a thing as cross repertoire motifs. There are motifs throughout the, when we try to categorize the way this whole system works, we have certain settings, but there are motifs that cut through those different settings. I can refer you to the article, but it's really far from saying not cross repertoire. Cross repertoire motifs is one of the most difficult, dominant, and significant aspect of how the music of liturgical music in the Ashkenazi tradition behaves. It also serves a lot of different functions, and again, they could be cadences, they could be traditions, they could be elaborations, they could be a whole bunch of things. So I really need to correct this impression so people do not come out of it sort of under appreciating this phenomenon. It's huge.
Okay, I want to refer to, and just I see here in the chat.
Ruth, maybe I see that Alex, I see that Alex Klein is raising his hand, so maybe we can, Alex.
Sure.
Hi, thank you, Ruthie. Very, very interesting. Various different tunes, Kol Nidre, you only touched on them as far, I mean, there are four major ones that I know, complete works, modern, if you want to call it that way, and various different people have composed or sung Kol Nidre from Al Jolson to Sirota, you know, so it's been on the normal Timpan Alley scene to the liturgical scene in the synagogue. Oi, 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 I understand. But what happened before Hasidism? What happened before the Hasidic movement introduced these various different sounds into the service? Was it because they took over the oi, oi, ois instead of instruments, which took that place maybe from the Avoda services or various other services in the temple? Or when did the crossover happen, and when did it become modern enough for us to understand this concept that we have today? Because it's very confusing. It was also taken out, if you remember correctly. We learned last week that it was banned for a while. So what do they do in between? Did they start at Ma'ariv and the Baruch Hu and then right into the service? And what took its place, if anything? And what do we have today? I mean, there's various different things. I'm sorry to go on, but I'm trying to get everything out as simple as possible.
Thank you, Alex. You asked so many questions. We need several seminars for all of these. But what I think that the question what unifies your questions, and also one of the chats that I saw beforehand, I remember who was that? Marsha, I think it was you. I think it's difficult for people to understand that this is a phenomenon. It's not a chance. It's not just one thing. It's many things put together. And they were not, we want to see when it passed from here to there, but you have an idea which is very much related to what you know, what you are familiar with. That what you are familiar with is partially related to what I refer to in the end. That at a certain moment, especially in the United States, it became much more uniform. And as such, people tend to forget that cantors, shlichei tzibur, can do all kinds of things. And what we try to show tonight is just the tip of the iceberg of the very different solutions to it. So, and it's very much in contrast with what we have, the concept that we have of work in the Western tradition. The Symphony No. 9 is something that's very clear. It's a work which has an identity. Kol Nidre does not have this sort of identity. It starts, of course, from the text itself, and the question that Marsha asked is referring to that. The fact that things are changing all the time because we are speaking partially of an oral tradition, not about the text so much. So when exactly they started to say, Miyom Kippurim ze ve'ad Yom Kippurim haba aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael tova, and who wanted to take it out and who put it in, and I really found this particular machzor in which you have both. And I had such a machzor when I was a young girl, from which I had, and that's the way that in the Hasidic synagogue I used to go, they did. So you cannot put it just in one basket. That's what I want to say. And the richness of it is what it is. So in a way, it's a map. That's why we referred beforehand to the metaphor of map, that in order to map it all and to understand where it went. So what we know by now is not so much, even what we try to do for tonight and a little bit beforehand, because you have to put all those very different, those that are available to us, and it's quite a lot, and to try through them and to chart some sort of maps. We don't have it at the moment. That's what I want to say.
I just want to add one more thing to the same topic, because again, to correct perhaps misinformation, those those what you call IAIs now, and they were done differently. They were never really played by instruments. It was never instrumental. It just sounded like an instrument. It really does plug into, we can't get into it, but there was an issue of Chazan bass singer, and basically the bass and the singer, they did all sorts of vocal effects that were supposed to sound like instruments. And it might very well be that at some point the Jews also felt that it's ridiculous, or that they were influenced by the criticism that came out of the community. And so either they did that. I'm not sure that Hasidism basically one-on-one replaced those with IAIs. I'm just saying that because we have IAIs, and it's sort of a Hasidic minhag, then perhaps this is how they would sort of resolve the problem, so it doesn't sound like a stupid person trying to imitate a trumpet. But it was never a trumpet.
Because I listened only last week to Al Jolson, two recordings, not the Kol Nidre, but the Israel and Hatikva, and because there was a musician strike, so it was all voices, so it took the place of instruments on those two recordings. Nobody notices it unless they're told about it, then they listen. So what I'm trying to say is voice can interpret instruments without you even being aware of the fact, and do a good job without that actually interfering. So there is a chicken and egg. I don't know. There is a possibility. I wouldn't just throw it away.
Yeah, but I think we should move on, because this is taking.
Sorry, Boaz.
Yes, exactly.
I saw that Malcolm, you wanted to ask a question?
Dangers of putting up your hands. Yes, thank you so much for that really fascinating dialogue and exchange of ideas. Just actually, I had, two questions. One actually was to Boaz about your example of the Kaddish, and when you actually said that the tune is the congregation. And I was just wondering, it's a general point, about Sinai melodies, but if the motivic content of the Kol Nidre is analyzed, that there are elements similar to what you just the beginning of the Kaddish. So at what point do you call it motivic, and what point do you call it a melody? That was just a technical, analytical.
Listen, I don't want to get into this in the difference between motifs and what melody is, etc. What I can say, though, in terms of this Kaddish, is that it's very apparent that the was not originally there, and it's not part of its Sinai thing, but it is one of those patterns in which the congregation enters, and it enters where it should not enter. That's the point, because they do enter Yehesh Be'ira B'Magoa, that I understand, but the fact that they also turn into some fragment when they're not supposed to, that to me shows that, first of all, we know that it's a later edition, but it also perhaps points to the point that because this is what the congregation normally does in those particular situations, they sort of, eventually, some kind of evolution process, they felt the need to do it because they understood or intuit that this is the moment, and in a moment, this is what we do. Just one little comment, because the Chatzi Kaddish so far as Sinai tunes is an exception, and it's a problematic issue because all of the Sinai tunes are basically defined by their beginning. But the Chatzi Kaddish, when we look at the older versions, they have different beginnings. And so that's a different thing. I also think that the congregational melody that we have is actually a congregation's making up a melody from a melisma elaboration that was there before. There is one that we hear in the Ravel Kaddish. All of the old versions have that. And I can't get into here, but I actually wrote about it too, how this particular elaboration may have become a melodic fragment to participate. And in our case, it also re-strengthened the feel that even intuitively they felt that they need this kind of pattern in a moment, and therefore they took that elaboration and turned it into a melodic congregational singing.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. More questions? Okay, so maybe I'll ask my question now. So you began with the concept of the moment, and I'd like to take you a bit from the musicological discourse into the performative discourse with the concept of the moment. And I think that in a way, Ruth, when you read Zelda's beautiful poem, you touched a bit on that, but maybe we can also talk about the moment of the body and what happens to the body and to the singing body and to the praying body and to the participating body in that moment. Maybe you can say something about that.
It's a good question. In my next intervention in December, I will refer to it. But there is something which comes up in several descriptions of this moment, because it's so emblematic that there are very beautiful and touching descriptions of it. If you read, for example, the description that Shai Agnon is having on what the kind of impression that he had from the gathering of people in the synagogue as a very young boy of 5 years old or something like that. All these people wearing the white kittles with always the light, the fact that also Zelda has this imagery of the candles. There's so many candles, and we should remember that until the end of the 19th century, that was the only light in the synagogue. There was no electricity. So that's and lots of these candles, and people, of course, moving. And this moving was actually part of the music, the libel against the Jews, because in Christianity, we don't have it. And people are gathering, and they just, after they ate, and they know that now they're preparing themselves also for the fasts. And there is a lot of emotions that are brought into that moment, of big expectations, all sorts of expectations for the day, from the Shliach Tzibur, the Chazan, the cantor, from the people themselves, and all of this is somehow is converging into the general feeling, the general atmosphere that is there. I don't want to spoil those beautiful descriptions of Agnon, of Reich himself, but it repeats itself. That this is something that it's very difficult to put in words, because it is indeed an experience also of all these bodies, not just one body, all these bodies together, and the sound and the light and the smell as well, and all that are entering into the general experience.
Thank you. Mark?
So I have a question for both of you, maybe perhaps mostly for Boaz. It occurred to me as you're going through the various tunes that you're showing a sense of transmission and formation, that kind of in the Gestalt, there's a very, very complex network of melodies. And we kind of have this assumption, or we want to find, these patterns or ways in which that it's working. And I'm just curious with the various sources that you've looked at, if you can comment on perhaps any regional influences. I know that it goes into maybe more specifics, but I'm just curious if there's like a big picture at work here of a certain network of Kol Nidre tunes.
These are two questions. I mean, the whole idea of transformation and promulgation of melodies is one thing, and the network of different Kol Nidres, it's hard to tell. I mean, it's hard to say. First of all, we have to sort of divide it into the 19th century or 18th, from which we only have written sources, to 20th century, especially in America, and Israel, which people come up with more and more and more tunes. I cannot point to sort of like a network or a connection between the different tunes as they come about now. In the old the manuscripts, we see a few. We also can tell when in the liturgy they're more likely to be. But again, in terms of their connectedness to each other, I don't know. I don't know if there is or not. I think it would be almost impossible to find out because there is no documentation. In terms of the Kol Nidres, look, I mean, this is actually just an initial. Ruth and I are planning to look at a lot more Kol Nidre versions to see all these different permutations and how they behave. And then maybe we could come up with some kind of a net of how they influence each other or if they fall into different categories, etc. But again, I guess that it will be very difficult to do because, again, all we have is music transcriptions with no verbal discourse of that kind of stuff. Perhaps we can find something. And I think that's all that we can provide so far as this topic is concerned. But Ruth may have something more to add to this.
Ruth, you need to unmute yourself.
Just want to emphasize, yes, I just want to emphasize again that there is a logic in this kind of forest of opportunities, to go back to the same imagery of Zelda. What we showed is that the beginning should be always like that, and the ending is some sort of this triumphant motif. And in between, there are all sorts of ways of how to go about it. The going about it, what we call in a different connection, mode of conduct, is something that has a certain cognitive logic and emotional logic, and which is related also to, of course, to the text itself. So what I tried to emphasize beforehand is that if you choose a certain way, within it, it compels you to go in, later on to do several things in order to make it all coherent. It must be coherent. And the question of coherence is related to the particular way that you did. Of course, cantors, once they have created or once their own version crystallized, they do not tend to change so much, but still you see that from one year to the other, they're not doing the same. And that's all the fascination about this phenomenon. And this is also the reason why Arnold Schoenberg, mentioned him before him. Arnold Schoenberg had his work composed in 1938, as I mentioned, to a reform text, to a reform text by Zandberg, the Rabbi Zandberg, who gave him the text. And he was quite sure that this is going to be spread around and that many temples and synagogues will adopt it. And it never happened. And the fact that it never happened is related to the fact that it was too fixed and strict. It's a beautiful piece for a concert hall, but it does not fit the logic of the synagogue. If you're doing something that it's already there, recomposed and predetermined, you do not allow for this kind of routine, what I mean, the performativity, which must respond to the moment in the sense of the fact that we are not the same as we were last year. We were not the same as we were 10 years ago. And so we have to give somehow expression to the change and to how the community behaves this year and how the country feels tonight. So all these things, when you have to go by the book here, the score itself, they cannot happen. So that's part of the phenomenon, what I call the phenomenon.
Thank you, Ruth. Our last comment tonight is reserved to Yair Lifshitz, which will also be our next presenter in the third session. Yair.
Thank you, Ruthie, and thank you, Ruth and Boaz. This has been a really mind-opening, mind-blowing presentation, and I have a lot of questions, but I will not ask them now. It's about the history of music and how you trace them, but that's another issue. So I was just asked to give you a promo for our next session, which is in 4 weeks, and in a sense, it will perhaps follow up on Ruthie's question now about the performative aspect of Kol Nidre. There are some things which I think will really echo things we've heard today, mainly Kol Nidre as a hypertext or an intertext and the way it relates to other texts. I will take a theatrical rather than a musicological take on this, and the way that the space of the synagogue during Kol Nidre somehow echoes other spaces from the Yom Kippur liturgy. And maybe this will also be, maybe next session will be a promo for the session after that, from what Ruth told us, that will really deal with the senses and the body, which I will not talk about, but perhaps it will give some introduction to that. So we will talk about Kol Nidre as a prologue, not an overture, but a prologue in the theatrical sense to the liturgy of Yom Kippur. And besides me, Dr. Elazar Ben Lulu will speak about, from an ethnographic point of view, will speak about Kol Nidre in Israeli gay LGBTQ Reform Synagogue in Tel Aviv. So we will have two looks on the performance of Kol Nidre.
So thank you so much. Thank you so much to our two speakers, Boaz and Ruth. This has been really fascinating. I think we've all learned a lot. And thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you for keeping socially distant and intellectually engaged. And we hope to see you all in the November 14th in our next session with Yair Lifshitz and Elazar Ben Lulu. Good night, everyone.
So thank you all very much. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.